Good evening to everyone out there in Zoom land on this Fat Tuesday of Mardi Gras. I welcome our members and prospective members to our first lecture of 2023. I'm Deanna Canini, president of this very engaged organization. I want to thank Virginia Pisley, who is sponsoring this lecture in memory of her husband, Bill, and their son, Jay. This is the third lecture that Ginny has sponsored. And thank you very much, Ginny. I know she's here with us today. Additionally, I want to thank all our dedicated supportive members who gave to our annual appeal. We've received over $32,000 toward our efforts to refresh the interpretive center so we may continue to vibrantly tell the stories of the Irish in Newport County and all their accomplishments and contributions. As I reported in the February newsletter, the work has begun, and I'll keep you posted as we progress. And it's a very exciting time. Newport Irish Heritage Month will begin next week. The High Holy Month of March. The calendar for the 46th Irish Heritage Month is now available on our website under the Events tab. The museum's events will include tours of the Bonnie Street Cemetery, trolley tours of Irish Newport, and dancing at 40 Steps. Plus, the Interpretive Center will be open selected weekends. We are also adding a new tour of St. Mary's Cemetery on Warner Street. We'll close out the month with a lecture by our illustrious former President Mike Slane on March 29th that will take you on a virtual tour of Irish Newport. We'll be back at the Wyndham for that lecture, plus it'll also be live streamed. Please check out the calendar on the website so you can plan your month celebrating your Irishness. Now to our main event. We welcome Maureen Brady, who is on the faculty of Rutgers University Osher Institute and Brookdale Community College, teaching courses in Irish history and Irish literature. Maureen received her Master of Arts degree from NYU in Irish and Irish American Studies, and also studied at Trinity College, Dublin. The past 2 years, Maureen has been named a top Irish American leader in New Jersey. She's on the steering committee and member of marketing director for the Irish American Cultural Institute, whose mission is to promote an intelligent appreciation of Ireland and the role of the Irish in American culture. Maureen is also the treasurer for the New York Irish History Roundtable. We're very fortunate to have such a scholar in Irish history and culture to present to us this evening. In recognition of Black History Month, please welcome Ms. Brady, live from New Jersey. Tonight's lecture, Sarah Parker Remond, a Black abolitionist in Ireland, 1859. And any questions you have during this lecture, please use the chat box. Maureen, over to you now. Thank you.
Thank you. And thank you. Good evening, everybody. And thank you, Deanna, for that lovely introduction. It's a pleasure to be with you tonight. I appreciate the invitation. I do want to note special thanks also to Virginia Pisley, who's sponsoring the talk in honor of her husband, Bill, and her son, Jay. So thank you for keeping these important conversations in the public domain. And lastly, thank you to all of you for joining us this evening. It's great to have such a terrific turnout, so thank you for that. It's always my privilege to talk about Sarah Parker Remond, but especially this month, Black History Month. It's an honor to do so. And as I talk, please feel free to put any questions you have in chat. And at the end, we'll certainly have time to look at those, and I'll be happy to respond to any outstanding questions you have. But the best place, I think, maybe to start with Sarah's life. My focus really is on her time in Ireland in 1859. But by way of a background of what came before and after, I do want to give you a kind of a whole framework of her life. And perhaps the best place to start is with her parents. John Remond and Nancy, whose maiden name was Lennox. John was actually born in the Dutch colony of Curacao, the island, in 1798. And his mother, Maritella, was a free Black woman who was born on the island, but there was political instability on the island. And she sent her son, John, at the young age of 10, I might add, on a ship to Salem, Massachusetts. And the young boy was taken under the wing of the captain, who set him up once they arrived in Salem as an apprentice to a hairdresser, which was a common reputation and a skill for African Americans at that time. He was also involved in the catering business, and on a trip to Boston in that capacity, he met his future wife, Nancy. Nancy was actually born in Newton, Massachusetts. She was a baker. She did some catering as well. And she was the daughter of a man named Cornelius Lennox, who had fought in the American Revolution with the Continental Army. So they were both freeborn. All their children then would be freeborn as well. But they would also trace their family roots to the founding of their nation through their maternal grandfather who fought in the American Revolution. John and Nancy were married in 1807. They were married for almost 60 years. And they had a very thriving business, the two of them, a catering business in Hamilton Hall, in Salem, Massachusetts. They owned various businesses. They had hairdressing businesses. Their daughters would go on to have wig businesses, but catering was sort of the primary focus of their work. They had a thriving business. They were really known as a hardworking family, an established family that were quite prosperous for the time. And they did many public engagements. And one of the most important ones they did was a public dinner that was given in honor of the Marquis de Lafayette. So they were used to dealing with white customers, also white individuals as friends, and entertaining them through their catering business as well. And so they were commercially very successful. John and Nancy had 10 children. They had 7 daughters and 3 sons. As I mentioned, they were freeborn. They were all born in Salem, Massachusetts. And as you note there on the right-hand side of the screen, the woman we're talking about, Sarah Parker Remond, was the second youngest of all their children. And she and her daughter, Caroline, were very, very close their entire life. Now, Sarah, from a very young age, was a very smart individual, and she loved education. But she was going to school in Salem, and in 1834, the Salem School Committee decided and voted to segregate the schools. Sarah and her sister were dismissed from the East School for Girls, which was affiliated with the Salem High School. And Sarah would later call this, she would describe this as the reason for it as her unpopular complexion. So she felt that her skin was always a detriment to her, at least during her time as a young girl. She experienced, even though she was free, a lot of prejudice and a lot of discrimination. Now, all of the children were involved in the family businesses. They were also involved in the activism. Their parents were very, very involved in activism, in women's suffrage, even in this early period, in school desegregation, which was a very important part. They wanted the schools to be the mix of both white and Black students, but mostly abolition. And Mrs. Remond and her daughters were all founders of the Salem Female Anti-Slavery Society. So from a very young age, Sarah was involved in this whole idea of activism and being involved in the important things to make decisions and make things right. Education, of course, was always forefront in her mind because she felt she needed a good education in order to be able to be involved in all of these activities. And she once said, quote, "My strongest desire through life has been to be educated. I found the most exquisite pleasure in reading. I read every book which came my way, and I longed for more." And so when she and her sister had done well and were accepted into the school, she was very excited, but realizing when the schools desegregated, she could no longer attend, she was heartbroken. And she said, quote, "The teacher informed us that we were no longer permitted to attend the school. I wept bitter tears, and the memory of it is as fresh as ever in my mind, and like the scarlet letter of Hester is graven on my heart." So, of course, she's calling on Nathaniel Hawthorne's words from the Scarlet Letter, but this carried over into her adult life. And even as she would write articles in remembering times of her youth, this would stand out as a very critical time and a very difficult time for her. Now, when the school decided to segregate and open a school predominantly for Black children, it was, in John Remond's eyes, an inferior school. And so he made the decision at that point to move to Newport to enable his two youngest daughters to go to school. And during the time that they were in Newport, he continued to fight for desegregated schools, even as he was in Newport. When they got to Newport, and why did he choose Newport would be the question, of course. Well, Newport had a very active Black community and a very established one that was very well known and had been known to do very, very good work. As early as 1780, Black Newporters had founded the Free African Union Society. And the idea of the union was to help members in need and also to work to uplift the town's Black community. Isaac Rice, that you may have heard of, and this is his home on 23 Thomas Street in Newport. He was one of the most prominent Black citizens of Newport. And we understand that John Remond probably made Isaac Rice's acquaintance and knew of him. He was a community organizer, a campaigner for school desegregation, and also very involved in abolition. As a matter of fact, his home at 23 Thomas Street was a stop on the Underground Railroad. And we know when Frederick Douglass visited the area and lectured that he would often visit Isaac Rice and his family at their home. So a very important part of the history of Newporters of African heritage. And the other important part and the draw to Newport for the Remonds was the fact that they had the first free Black church in America, the Union Congregational Church at 49 Division Street, shown here. This church was built in 1834. It was an important, very important institution in Newport's Black community, but it also was home to the Newport Anti-Slavery Society that had both white and Black membership. So it wasn't, totally for Black Newporters, but also white Newporters who were involved in the anti-slavery movement would attend meetings there as well. And so you would find through this community, John decided to settle his family in Newport after his two youngest daughters were dismissed from school. And they also helped him establish his business. As I mentioned, John had a hairdressing business, and he set up his business. This is actually a trade card for him during his time in Newport at 137 Thames Street. So right in the center of activity of Newport. And so you can see from the card, very elegant, very professional, and how he's representing his business. And there's a few cards a few postcards that I want to share with you that Dan Titus was nice enough to share with me. They kind of give us a sense of, it's a little later period, but it kind of gives us a sense of how busy and active and central Thames Street was. But the 137 address, we just found out in the last few days through some help with the Newport Historical Society that John Remond actually purchased the building. And there's a deed in the Newport files showing his ownership of it. So although we don't know the family's address in the town, it's possible and very probable that they not only conducted business in Thames Street, but they also probably lived there above the business premises. Now here's a wonderful postcard. The title, the caption is Thames Street Looking North in Newport. And I thank Dan Titus for this. But it gives us, this is the street where the Remond business was located. Although this was circa 1890, the Remonds would have lived there from 1835 to 1841. It's a little bit later period, and yet it really kind of shows us the bustling town center, white businesses and black businesses operating side by side, a very active community. And another sort of look at old Newport, which I'm sure you enjoy seeing, and the evolution of it from that time. So we get an idea, maybe his building was across from Star Theater, but there might have been a change of numbering systems in Salem after this period of time. So although the pictures are from a little bit later time, they give us a sense that his business was very centrally located, and obviously he had done very well in Salem, and he was able to afford the building that he operated in. Now, despite what you might think, this is not an eye chart, but it is a copy of the US Census in 1840. And the census places the family in Newport. At the very bottom on the left-hand side, you can see it just says Newport, but the line that I have highlighted in the center is John Remond. And in the upper right-hand corner, it identifies the free color people who live at that home and are associated with John Remond as the head of household. So just kind of calling that out so you can see what those columns actually say. We identify 3 males in the household from the age of 10 all the way up to 55. So John is probably the male aged between 36 and 55, and then 5 females. Nancy Remond, the mother, is probably the woman between 36 and 55. And then, of course, Caroline and her sister Sarah would be the 2 aged between 10 and 24. So if we link up their birth years to the ages shown on the census, we see John the father, and then his son, John Lennox Remond, and their son Cornelius, and then Nancy, their mother, and 4 of their daughters, Maritza, Cecilia, Sarah, and Caroline. So what's, exciting about the census is we can actually physically place all of them in Newport at the time. And we also know the reason, of course, for them traveling to Newport and moving there, residing there in the first place, was because Sarah and her sister were dismissed from the school in Salem. And the school that they attended would have been the African Benevolent Society School at 8 School Street, on March 25th, 1808, announcing the opening of the school that was to be kept by a gentleman named Newport Gardner. And the purpose of the school was, quote, the free instruction of all the colored people in this town. So we place their business, who in the family is in Newport, and also the school that Sarah and her sister, Caroline, would have been attending. Now, the family, as I mentioned, lived in Newport until 1841. And at that point, they decided to move back to Salem for 2 reasons. One was that Caroline and Sarah were finished with their schooling, but also 2, that John, in his activism to help desegregate the schools in Salem, was successful. And so at that point in 1840, actually, the school in Salem desegregated. In 1841, the family moved back to Salem. Now, when they moved back, of course, as I mentioned earlier, Sarah's quote is she loved to read. She loved any book that would come her way, she would pick up and read it. And she was very close to her older brother, Charles Lennox Remond. Charles was also a very active abolitionist. He had visited Ireland in 1840, 1841. He'd lectured aside the great Daniel O'Connell in Ireland. He's called the Liberator because he worked on Catholic emancipation. Catholics in Ireland were subject to the penal laws. They couldn't practice their religion. And so Daniel O'Connell was somebody who worked for the Catholics to have equal rights. But he was also himself an avid abolitionist as well. And after Charles returned from Ireland, he brought with him an address from the people of Ireland. And the purpose of this address that was written out in a scroll, was to persuade the Irish people in America to use their influence against slavery, to join the cause of abolition. And I'll just call out this quote on the screen that was written within it, signed by Daniel O'Connell and 60,000 other inhabitants of Ireland. And he said, quote, "Irish men and Irish women, treat the colored people as your equals, as brethren. By all your memories of Ireland, continue to love liberty, hate slavery, claimed by the abolitionists, and in America, you will honor the name of Ireland." So imagine young Sarah hearing her brother's stories. Her brother was 14 years her senior, so much more experience in traveling and lecturing. He came back from Ireland with glowing stories of Daniel O'Connell and the support of the Irish people, and then reading this address from the people of Ireland. You can imagine that it would have instilled in this young girl a very positive feeling toward the Irish people who supported a cause that was so important to her and to her family and to her race. By the way, Charles Lennox Remond's friend was Frederick Douglass. He was a friend of the Remond family, and he also visited Ireland. He visited a little bit later in 1845. He was friends with Charles and Sarah, often traveling with them on lecturing tours in the United States. And at the time he traveled to Ireland, he had just published his narrative in America. And so as an escaped slave, he had sort of profiled himself as such and decided to travel to Ireland and Great Britain. And when he was in Ireland, he actually published an Irish edition of the narrative. He also met and befriended Daniel O'Connell. And when O'Connell heard his tremendous oration skills, he dubbed him the Black O'Connell. Now, Frederick Douglass found his time in Ireland was transformative. He said, "I find myself not treated as as a man, not as a thing, but as a being equal as a common God, as the common father of us all." Now, when he traveled to Ireland in 1845, it was at the very beginning of the Great Famine, the Great Hunger. And I'm sure that you've heard many talks on that before, where over a period of the next 7 years, over 1 million people died from starvation or disease, 1.5 million more emigrated. And so when Frederick Douglass visited Ireland, he saw very similar things in Ireland that he had experienced himself. And he said, quote, "There is much here to remind me of my former condition, human misery, ignorance, degradation, filth, and wretchedness." But he did, although he recognized the similarities in the condition, he drew out a significant difference, that the Irish were free. They were free to immigrate, to build new lives in America, whether that be in Boston or Newport or Providence or New York. And that was not a freedom that the slaves in America could share with them. And he said, quote, "In Ireland, he was transformed." He said, quote, "Instead of the bright blue sky of America, I am covered with the soft gray fog of the Emerald Isle. I breathe, and lo, the chattel becomes a man." So again, with Sarah being friends with Frederick Douglass, once again, she hears these tremendous stories of Ireland and the great Daniel O'Connell. And it is just instilled with this wonderful awe of their experience. So although she worked for the family businesses, she said that her heart was not in the work. And what she wanted to do was become a lecturing agent, which she did in 1856. She became an agent for the American Anti-Slavery Society. She toured the Northeast with prominent abolitionists, men and women, Black and white, all speaking against slavery. And some of the people that she would speak with on stages were very well known people of the time. The well-known abolitionist and editor of the Liberator newspaper, William Lloyd Garrison, was a friend of the Remond family and a personal friend of Sarah herself. And she would speak on stages alongside of Susan B. Anthony, Frederick Douglass, Lucretia Mott, Wendell Phillips, Abby Foster. And on these tours, when they would have to stay overnight at different inns or boarding houses, Sarah and her brother would be turned away because of the color of their skin. So again, it emphasized this pervasive discrimination and prejudice. Although she was free, she didn't feel free. She didn't feel equal because she was always separated and had to stay different places, couldn't stay with the white lecturers on the tour. And this just increased her sense of exclusion. So after 2 years of traveling and lecturing with the American Anti-Slavery Society, Sarah decided to travel to Great Britain to support the cause of abolition. And like her brother and Frederick Douglass before her, she decided she would make the same type of journey. In September of 1858, she applied for a U.S. passport, and she visited an official of the United States government, a man named Joseph Waters, who he was the notary public for Essex County in Massachusetts. And her purpose in visiting with him was to get a notarized affidavit. And we have that. It has her description, perhaps one of the only descriptions we have of her. It says, quote, she's a single woman, age 32 years old, about 5.5 feet in stature, forehead high, eyes black, nose straight, mouth full, dark complexion and face. And it affirms her status as a citizen of Salem and a native citizen of the United States. Now, I stress this because this will be challenged a few years later. In December of 1859, she sailed from Boston to Liverpool. And although she was on a mission to speak out and lecture on behalf of slavery, she admitted to a friend that she also had a personal goal, quote, that I might for a time enjoy freedom. So as I mentioned, although she was freeborn, she felt that maybe in Ireland and Great Britain, based on stories that she heard from her brother and Frederick Douglass, she too might be able to experience that same sense of freedom that they enjoyed. And in a later letter to Frederick Douglass, she said that the trip was stormy. You can imagine being on the Atlantic Ocean in December. There was ice on the ship. It was freezing cold. She experienced terrible seasickness for most of her journey. And she said, quote, I can never forget the beauty and at times the awful grandeur of the Atlantic Ocean. And so she arrives in Liverpool. And when she arrives in Liverpool, she takes a few days to recuperate from her trip because she's still a little weakened by not being able to eat and feeling seasick. And then she starts giving a few lectures. She gives a lecture in Liverpool and 2 in Warrington before heading to Ireland in March. And so when she goes to Ireland, she is actually helped on her tour by the founders of the Hibernian Anti-Slavery Society. And the founders were these 3 men, Richard Allen, James Houghton, and Richard Davis Webb. All of them were educated as Quakers, and they embraced humanitarian causes. Now, the Quakers were very important on both sides of the Atlantic for their work in abolition. And these men were extremely supportive of American abolitionists when they came to visit, but also in fundraising and sending money back to the United States for the cause of anti-slavery. And they had hosted Charles Lennox Remond and they had hosted Frederick Douglass, so they went to work to also use their contact and their network to help Sarah set up a lecture tour. And they particularly availed of the ladies' anti-slavery societies throughout Ireland. And these ladies also worked very closely with their American counterparts for decades. Hannah Webb, as a matter of fact, Richard's wife, and his daughters were members of the Dublin Ladies Anti-Slavery Society. And while Sarah was in Dublin, she actually stayed at the home of Richard and Hannah Webb at their home on Great Brunswick Street, which is now Pierce Street. This is very, very central to the city of Dublin, so she would have been right in the heart of things. Richard Webb was a printer, and Richard also was responsible for the publication of the Irish edition of Frederick Douglass's narrative. And so here's a copy of the front page of it, as you see, kind of called out in the red box, printed in Dublin by Webb and Chapman at Great Brunswick Street, the Irish edition of the narrative of the life of Frederick Douglass, an American slave, written by himself. And there were actually 2 runs of the publication. There would have been one for 2,000 copies, which sold out immediately, and they did a second run of another 2,000 copies. So the Webbs were very, very supportive of Frederick, who more than likely stayed with them on his visit to Dublin as well. And I love this observation by Webb about Sarah. He actually sort of compares the 2 of them. He says, she's very clever, the most so of all the colored people I ever met, except Douglass, and is a much more sensible and thoroughgoing person than he. She has common sense, and her devotion to the cause and its friends is thorough. We like her very much. This is sort of a rousing endorsement for Sarah from a man who was clearly a very great supporter of the anti-slavery movement. So Sarah's lecture tour in Ireland begins in Dublin in March of 1859. And this lecture tour establishes her as the first Black woman in history to speak publicly in Ireland. Now, she was doing many things that were unusual for a woman, even more extraordinary for a Black woman. First of all, to take this transatlantic journey on her own, and then to actually speak in public. This wasn't a time that women spoke in public on these weighty issues, and she took it upon herself to be the first to do this in Ireland. So she begins her tour in Dublin. She was only scheduled to do 1 lecture on March 11th. They were so important and so crowd-pleasing, and she spoke to standing room only capacity that they added 2 more lectures as well. They were organized by the Dublin Ladies Anti-Slavery Society. The mayor sent a letter of support. It was chaired by James Houghton of the Hibernian Anti-Slavery Society. And at the end of her speech, which was interrupted multiple times by rousing applause and cheers of "hear, hear," she was endorsed for her great work by 3 esteemed professors of Trinity College in Dublin. She spoke for over an hour and a half. She spoke without notes, and she spoke eloquently. She spoke fervently, and she really made a great case for the cause of anti-slavery. She continued her journey into Waterford, and there she made 3 more speeches. The lectures were at the town hall. They were chaired by the esteemed physician of the town, Dr. John Eliot, and again, followed by resolutions of praise and support. There was a collection taken up, and she was praised, and speeches of endorsement made by 6 dignitaries of the town. And then on to Clonmel in the center of the country. And when she gets to Clonmel, she gives a lecture on April 14th at a place called the Mechanics Institute. The Mechanics Institute was actually set up throughout Ireland for the improvement of people's minds. So many esteemed people would give speeches at the Institute on various subjects, and again, receives great praise. It was chaired by the mayor of the town, Alderman Hackett, and she's lauded by both government official and members of the clergy. So she has a very, very successful tour, and her last stop is in Cork. And in Cork, she presented 2 lectures on April 15th and 18th at the Imperial Hotel. And once again, she relies on the Ladies Anti-Slavery Society to help her set up the tour, to advertise it. And then the meeting itself was chaired by Francis Beamish, who was a member of Parliament, and he was the president of the Cork Anti-Slavery Society. So she receives a tremendous amount of support for her time in Ireland, and she speaks on very difficult subjects. In this picture, the caption of it is "A slave father sold away from his family." And her speeches were powerful and uncompromising in their directness. And Dr. Eliot in Waterford, as a matter of fact, said what he admired most was, quote, Sarah's truthfulness. She was not afraid to speak the truth, though it might give some offense, end quote. Because in her talks, Sarah criticized the American political system that allowed slavery to flourish, stressing that freedom was the right of every individual. And she denounced the racial prejudice that was rampant against free people of color as well. And she also cited the Dred Scott decision that any Black person in America, slave or free, was not a citizen of the United States and had no rights. A decision, she pointed out, that was made by 9 judges of the Supreme Court, 5 of whom were slave owners. So she went to the very heart of the matter. She specifically talked about the destruction of families, as in this picture, husbands and wives being torn apart, children separated from their mothers, never to be reunited. Now, separation of families would have been keenly understood in the Ireland of this time, because this was 1859. The famine had only ended in 1852, and the country was still recovering. And yet 1 million people had died, more than 1.5 million had immigrated. So families understood separations of families and never again to see those members who had passed away or who had immigrated during the famine. So although the factors causing the separation of Irish families were vastly different, and we should never conflate them, the results, of course, would be the same: heartfelt and irreparable loss. And the members of her audience would have understood exactly the topics that she was talking about. Sarah also broached a topic that no one had touched on before, and that was the auctioning of slave women, specifically women who were mulatto, who were more white-skinned, more fair-skinned. And she talked about the horrors endured by vulnerable slave women, particularly sexual exploitation by white masters who were using them as breeders for a new generation of slaves. Imagine these difficult topics that she was talking about as a woman in front of these filled to capacity rooms. And she said, quote, "The female slave is the most deplorably and helplessly wretched of human sufferers." She spoke of fair-skinned slave women being placed on the auction block for sale, women whose fathers were white plantation owners. She depicted them as having, quote, "cheeks like the lily and the rose," a description that could have applied to any of the Irish women attending her lectures. And she said, though the women were white-skinned, they were slaves because 1 drop of Black blood flowed in their veins. She said, quote, "The more Anglo-Saxon blood that mingles with the blood of the slave, the more gold is poured out when the auctioneer has a woman for sale, because they are sold to be concubines for white Americans." So Sarah revealed how these white complexion, fair complexion girls and women commanded the highest prices. Difficult, very shocking almost topics that she was undaunted in bringing into the public domain. And even so, the descriptions of Sarah and her talks in the Irish press were very, very positive. Quote, "Her style of public speaking is even, low-voiced, yet clear-toned, fluent." In all that she said, there was something so persuasive, so femininely beautiful. She is, quote, "feminine and graceful, coupled with a quiet, dignified manner." Quote, her manner is gentle yet impressive, her countenance intelligence and animated, her language pure, her diction copious, and her thoughts elevated. So she receives very, very positive reviews on all of the talks that she gave. While she was in Ireland, she gave 3 talks in Dublin, 3 in Waterford, 1 in Clonmel and Tipperary, and 2 in Cork. And she spent about 6 weeks in Ireland giving 9 lectures. She understood that a woman speaking in public was atypical and that the words that she spoke were weighty. But she used her gender, her femininity, her agency to seize this opportunity to highlight topics rarely, if ever, discussed by male abolitionists. Slavery was uncomfortable. Female slavery was even more so. And by doing so, by talking about this difficult subject, Sarah Remond made a singular contribution to the anti-slavery movement. That is, she depicted the condition of female slaves. And this unique perspective helped bring harsh realities to light that were generally unspoken. So like Frederick Douglass before her, Sarah found her time in Ireland to be life-changing. And after her sojourn in Ireland, she returned to lecture in England and Scotland. And along the way, she met a woman named Elizabeth Jesser Reed, who was a philanthropist and a reformer, who had also opened a school, a higher education institute for women called Bedford College. And she invited Sarah to attend the school, and she also invited Sarah to reside with her when she was in London. And so Sarah was delighted because, as I mentioned earlier, and that you've heard, and Newport was very important to the education of her early days, Sarah still felt she was, what she said, quote, in need of a good English education. And so she enrolled at Bedford College. And we have some of her transcripts that show some of the classes that she took. The register shows she took classes in European history, modern history, English literature, arithmetic, French, music, Latin, elocution. So even she's a conditioned and an experienced speaker, she's still taking classes in elocution to improve her public speaking capabilities. And so we see again that education is central to her life, very, very important. And while she's attending school, she continues to travel throughout England and Scotland to lecture on the cause of abolition and eradicating slavery in America. And between 1859 and 61, she delivered almost 50 speeches in Ireland, England, and Scotland. And by the 3rd term of her college education, we find a note in her portfolio that says, quote, these classes were found to be quite unsuitable owing to the peculiar circumstance of the student, meaning she was traveling so much, it was very hard for her to manage her education as well. But in each place that Sarah traveled when she was giving her lectures, she found that she was greeted and treated as an equal by those she met. And during her time traveling, she wrote to a friend saying, quote, I have been received here as a sister by a white woman for the first time in my life. I have been removed from the degradation which overhangs all persons of my complexion. I have received a sympathy which I never before was offered. And so she feels that she has finally come to this place of equality where she's being treated as an equal and she's being treated as someone on par with those of a white, lighter complexion. But she also finds very shortly that even in England, she can't escape the US government's racial discrimination policy. Because in December of 1859, when she desires to travel to France, she visits the US Embassy in London to get a visa on her passport, the passport that's been issued by Joseph Waters in Salem. And she's denied. And she's denied because the U.S. minister, who would be today's ambassador, George Dallas at the time, refuses to issue her the passport on the grounds that she does not possess the necessary qualifications, i.e., she was no longer a U.S. citizen because of the Dred Scott decision, which said no person with Black blood in America was a citizen of the United States. And Sarah, being the public person she was, brought the situation to the press. You can see on the left of the screen, she has her letter published, and then the response from Benjamin Moran, who's the Assistant Secretary of Legation, or the Secretary to the U.S. Ambassador. And the title of it is An American Lady of Color in a Strange Situation. And this letter and this situation actually finds its way into U.S. newspapers as well. And the Irish and the British newspaper headlines do not have a very positive reflection. They say, quote, the aristocracy of color, quote, fie on America, American tyranny of color, the land of liberty, question mark, and disabilities of American persons of color. Because Sarah brought the situation to the press saying, it was extraordinary that free persons who pay taxes are deprived of their rights because of, quote, a dark complexion. So once again, she brings the situation to the forefront to make it very public. But the U.S. Embassy refuses to issue a visa for her to travel to France, and she ends up having a visa issued by the British Embassy and then goes on her trip to France. But it is not a very positive look for America in Irish and British newspapers. What's interesting, I found, Benjamin Moran, who we saw, had written back to Sarah that he could not give her a visa for travel, wrote in his diary on February 25th, 1860, the following, quote, on this subject of darkies, I am reminded that the Queen looked at me very oddly on Thursday, and now I suspect the Remond affair was dancing around in her mind, and that she wished to know what kind of person the secretary was that refused the lady of color a visa. What I love about that quote, and I share with you, is because this humble woman who couldn't find a way to get educated in the United States is suddenly drawing the attention of Queen Victoria. And so that is a wonderful diary excerpt to have, because we realize now she's come to the attention of the highest person in the land. After the Civil War ended and slavery ended, Sarah's work took on new facets. She campaigned on behalf of the freedmen, bringing their situation to light, working for their equal rights, doing fundraising for their aids. She was a founding member of the Ladies' London Emancipation Society. And from her early time in Salem, Sarah was involved in the suffrage movement, along with her mother and her sisters. In 1858, she and her brother Charles had spoken at a women's rights convention in New York City. In London in 1866, she was the only woman of color to sign the first women's suffrage petition requesting women's right to vote. 1,499 women signed the suffrage petition, and it was supported by the Member of Parliament, John Stuart, shown here, and he presented the petition to Parliament on June 6, 1866. And so we have this artifact showing her signature and her involvement in the suffrage movement. Later in that year, in 1866, she decided to move to Italy. And in London, she had been involved in the Society of the Friends of Italy. That had been founded by Giuseppe Manzini and Giuseppe Garibaldi, who were working for the unification of Italy at the time, and she was very sympathetic to their goals. In 1866, she moves permanently to Italy, first to Florence and then to Rome, and she makes a decision to enter medical school in 1866 at the age of 42 years old. She completed her studies and she became a doctor, and she actually practiced medicine in Italy for the next 20 years. Now, her decision to move to Italy probably was influenced by her friendship with Mazzini and Garibaldi, but we don't know why she made the decision to go to medical school, but she entered, she completed, and she became a doctor. So once again, taking it to another new level. And then she relocates to Florence, from Florence to Italy. We know at 52 years old, she surprises us again. She gets married to an Italian native named Lazzaro Pintor. And at that point, she changes her name to Sarah Remond Pintor. She moves to Rome and resides at number 6 Piazza Barberini, shown here. The building is still there where she lived. And not much is known about her husband. We think maybe he was involved in Italy's reunification efforts and had been part of the Society for the Reunification founded by Mazzini and Garibaldi. But very little is known about him, and their marriage doesn't seem to have lasted, because at some point, Frederick Douglass visits her. She's no longer with her husband, but her 2 sisters are living with her in Italy at that point. And on a trip to Rome, actually, in 1887, Frederick Douglass and his wife visited Sarah. And after he leaves and writes her a letter, she responds to him. And we have the letter exists at the Library of Congress in the papers of Frederick Douglass, which is a wonderful thing to have. And she says to him, quote, "Every day since you left, the English-speaking people have been going out of Rome. No one knows Italy till they see it in summer. The beauty heightens with the heat. I do not like the heat, but it does me good. I believe I shall be obliged to speak mostly Italian, as there will be perhaps in all of Rome only 2 or 3 persons that I know who speak English." Imagine this remarkable woman who in her early years feared her lack of a good English education would be a detriment to her, is now living in Italy, speaking Italian, and practicing medicine. It's a testament to what her friend Elizabeth Chase called Sarah's, quote, "indomitable energy and perseverance." Sarah died on December 13th, 1894. She was 70 years old and interned in the Protestant cemetery in Rome. Her burial spot was unknown for decades because she was buried under her married name, and it really wasn't known that she had married. That was a fact that kind of got lost to time. So it's wonderful being able to excavate her history and start piecing together her life story. In 2013, a memorial was placed near her final resting place that recognizes her as an African-American abolitionist and physician. And although Sarah's original plan was to live in Great Britain for only a year, she spent the rest of her life in Europe. And she never returned to the United States. From her early days to her time in Ireland and her final days in Italy, she fulfilled her wish, quote, to enjoy freedom. The freedom that allowed her to achieve things that would have been impossible in America, where she was constrained by discrimination and prejudice because of what she called her unpopular dark complexion. This accomplished freeborn daughter of America, who traced her roots to the founding of her nation through her maternal grandfather, who was a veteran of the American Revolution, ultimately had to spend her time thousands of miles away from the land of her birth in order to achieve what she felt was equality. And she chose exile over the inequality she experienced in America. And she became, in that time, an international champion of justice. So I conclude my talk with this quote from one of Sarah's speeches in Ireland, as a matter of fact. She said, it's a quote I think that can apply to Sarah herself. She said, quote, "The lives of good men are not lost when they die for justice. The just cause for which they rendered up their lives gives them immortality, and their spirits walk the earth. Thank you for allowing me to share Sarah's story with you this evening. And thank you for allowing me to give her the immortality that she deserves in a very well-lived life. I appreciate it. Thank you.
Well, we have to thank you, Maureen. That was an incredible story.
Thank you.
If everybody's mutes were not on, we would all be applauding you. I don't know if anyone has any questions.
Let's see.
Chat, one from Ginny.
I'm looking in chat, so let me see if I have.
And just as a reminder, if you do have any questions after we conclude, you can please just email us at newportirishhistory@gmail.com.
Well, I see lots of very nice comments. I don't see any questions in chat, but certainly feel free to enter your questions if you want to raise your hand. There's some new ones here. Let's see. You mentioned. Yeah, Anne Arnold asked a wonderful question. Thank you, Anne. I mentioned that Sarah spoke without notes, and she asked, are there any copies of her speeches? As a matter of fact, there's no copies of her speeches. And actually, what I'm doing right now is I'm compiling a book. I'm writing a book about Sarah, and I'm actually searching out the newspaper articles where they reported on her speeches, many of which are very, very detailed, and we can really reconstruct the speeches from those newspaper articles. They appeared in newspapers all over England, in Ireland. Some of them were in the Liberator, which was William Lloyd Garrison's newspaper. And so there are copies of her speeches, not in her handwriting, but as they were reported and heard by the journalists who attended her speeches. But one day, when I finish my book, and if anybody knows a publisher, send them my way. Hopefully we'll have that in print, because her words are just, even through that kind of second filter of a journalist writing it down, extraordinary in what she was able to write. And thank you, Michael. Thank you, Virginia, and thank you for your sponsorship. Just some very, yes, the truth about a wonderful African-American woman who really we know very little about. Someone asked, did Sarah's brother meet up with her in Ireland? No, he did not. He was 14 years her senior, so he had established himself in America and was also a speaker for the anti-slavery movement in America. So he did not travel with her at that time. The only trip that he took was in 1841.
What was the seed, Maureen, for your interest?
The seed for my interest was the fact that, you know, I'm an Irish historian, number one, and my interest is gender studies. And I sort of started down the path of doing research on the Irish ladies' anti-slavery societies, and then came upon this woman that they sponsored for these talks, and found I really wanted to know more about Sarah Parker Remond, because I could find very little about her when I started doing the research a few years ago. She's becoming a little bit better known by historians the more we put the word out about her. But it was, you know, how could somebody who was so remarkable not be known and not be, you know, in any history books? And so I wanted to sort of bring her voice back to life. Pat asked, did she stay in touch with her family? Oh, yes. What a great question. She not only stayed in touch with her family, but they often visited and lived with her for long periods of time when she was both in England and in Italy. And so we have her sisters staying with her. And then when they get married and have children, her nephews live with her in Italy for a while, then they get married and their families visit. So yes, absolutely. She was in very close contact with her family and had many of them living with her for periods of time. Jean asked, she tuned in late and missed an announcement about the complete recording after being available after the talk. Yes, I believe it's going to be on the museum's website. So thank you for asking that question.
And we'll notify everyone when it's available.
Yes, and Dan actually answered it. Yes, He said the recording will be posted on MNIH website in a few days. I'm sorry, I keep moving. I'm going down here. Let's see. Tom, do we know if her audience were mainly Quakers and Protestant Irish? That's a good question, Tom. Her audience, the speeches were free, so it would be a great cross section. There certainly would be a lot of Quakers in the audience because the Quakers in Ireland had a very, very strong movement against the American slavery movement and were very supportive of the American abolitionists as well, many of whom were Protestants as well. And they would be Protestant Irish, but there would be, because some of it, her talks, of course, were in towns, there would be some middle class Catholics probably attending her talks as well. Most of them were free, but when they added 1 or 2 talks based on her popularity, they would charge like 6 pence. So it would then have to be somebody who had accessible money. And of course, we know that most Catholics at that time, that would have been a difficult expenditure. Yes, it's fascinating to know that Sarah became a doctor. Is her medical focus known? We know that she was involved in midwifery. Beyond that, not much. And so we need to excavate those Italian records to find out, you know, if we can discover some more. And Sonia says, thank you much of the pace of the, thank you for the pace of information. You are so welcome. Thank you. You're welcome, Eileen. Yes, it's my pleasure to bring another lost woman. Yeah, because I'm not sure who writes the history books, but we definitely don't have all the women that need to be out there. So yes, thank you all. I think I got everybody. So thank you for all your questions and your positive comments. And as Ann said, if you have others, you can direct them as well. I appreciate it. And I thank you all for joining us tonight. A wonderful opportunity to share Sarah Parker Remond's story with you all. Thank you so much.
And have everyone go to the website, newportirishhistory.org, and to get the recording and anything else you want. Thank you very much, Maureen.
You're welcome. Thank you. Thanks, Tom.
And thank you all for attending, and thank you, Jenny.